started recording. There we go. Okay, so this is mostly for the people that are watching the recording. If you're taking notes again, make sure you put the time indicators, and then when you look at the bottom of the YouTube feed, it'll say at 2 minutes I was talking about something, just explain from there. And then make sure you take specific notes, at least one page front and back. So for everybody else, there's a sheet coming around, so make sure you sign in on that. So that the test is the same format as usual. It'll be half matching and half multiple choice. So the half matching is in groups of 10. It's very similar to what was on the chapter quizzes for the most part. So this test covers chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So chapter 6 is on sexuality. Chapter 7 is deviance. Chapter 8 is stratification in general. Chapter 9 is global stratification, and chapter 10 is gender stratification, okay? So those specific chapters, I try as best as possible to have an equal representation of everything. So about 10 multiple choice questions from each chapter, about 10 matching. So let's start with just the basics for the matching, and then the terms, what they are, and then we'll get into the application stuff. So chapter 6 on sexuality, some of the terms that you're gonna see in there are sex and gender, intersectionality is a term that you see in all of them. You'll also see intersexual, transsexual, bisexuality, heterosexuality, homosexuality. So be able to identify those terms. In general, again, if you know what the prefix means, you can apply that to figure out what the rest of the word means. So A means without, so asexuality would be individuals that express little sexual orientation or sexual desires. Homo means one, so homosexuality would be people that are attracted to people of one sex. Hetero means opposite. Homo means the same or one. And then you have bi means two, right? Like a bicycle. So bisexuality would be both. The difference between sex and gender, in short, is that sex has to do with biology and gender has more to do with mental or social construction. So when we talk about gender roles, it's the expected behaviors, because role is a behavior, that's tied to a specific gender. So just in terms of factual definitions for chapter 6, does anybody have any questions? Okay, so let's move on to chapter 7 then. Chapter 7 has to do with deviance. So remember, deviance is different. It sometimes means like immoral, but not necessarily. It just means different. So if you see some guy like walking through the mall with like neon hair, so like a stripe is purple, and then a stripe is orange, and then a stripe is pink, and a stripe is yellow, right? You might look at him like he's kind of weird, but you're not going to be offended or afraid or call him to get arrested or something, right? So, but that still would be deviant. Okay.
It's like homosexuality considered deviant too, so it's like
Yeah, and that's another thing I would say. So the question Quinn had was, is homosexuality considered deviant? I would say less so than in the past, but yeah. So it really would depend on where you're at. So if you're in San Francisco, which tends to be more of a open city for people of a variety of sexual orientations, then that'd be less deviant than Beach, North Dakota, where I'm from, right? So, yeah. And in some places, again, Quinn brought up a good point too, where what's considered deviant in one place might not be deviant in another. Or you might be deviant towards one group, but not towards another. So the example I believe I used in class was, let's say you move into a college dorm and then some people on the wing are really rowdy and they say, hey, we're gonna go party, let's go drink, right? You're breaking the law, so you're being deviant in that sense. But if you refuse to go with them, you're violating the kind of expectations. You're different than the other people that decide to go party. Yep. So that's where, remember I said the key distinction between sex and gender is that sex is biological and gender is socially constructed. So the difference between, if you want to say morality and deviance, is that deviance is more socially constructed, whereas morality, at least in the ethical sense, is based on something that's more transcendent than social construction, right? So we have this sense, like if you kill somebody, you've done something that's really wrong, right? Like there's something deeply wrong in that act. So even in like, so that's what it means from a moral standpoint. But if you were in Aztec culture and it was like the time where they had their festival to protect people from the gods, right? So in that sense you'd be, it's really loud now. In that sense you'd be deviant if you did not go along with killing the people, right? Because it's different, okay? So, part of me wants to wait till that's done, but. So, with deviance, we talked about crime. So crime is when you violate the formally enacted laws of a society. We talked about different types of crime. So crimes against the person, crimes against property, victimless crimes, right? So give me an example of a crime against the person. Give me an example of a crime against the person. Assault, yep. So something where you're like directly harming a person. So give me an example of a crime against property.
Vandalizing.
Yeah, like vandalism, stuff like that, good. And then how about a victimless crime? What do you say?
Stealing.
No, I wouldn't say stealing. No. So victimless, that would be more like crimes against property. So I would say like drug use, so marijuana, the norms around that have really weakened quite a bit. So even though you could argue that that person is like hurting themselves because of the effects of the drug, right? It could damage their lungs or whatever. They're choosing to do it willingly, right? There's no drug dealer like hooking them or whatever. Another example the text argues is prostitution, assuming that you have like somebody that's willingly choosing to do that. So it also talked about the difference between white collar, organized, and corporate crime. So be able to distinguish between those. So give me an example of a organized crime. No, organized crime. Yeah, gangs, the mafia. So for it to be organized crime, you have to have illegitimate business or organization whose purpose is to make money by breaking the law. So drug cartels, prostitution rings, those would be organized crime. Corporate crime is where you have a legitimate business that does something illegal for the benefit of the business. So an example of that, I could get the company wrong here, so I'm not intending to like make a company feel bad or accuse a company that didn't really do something, but I believe it was either Mercedes or VFW that there's in California and some other states, your vehicles have to get tested for emissions, and they hook your vehicle up to a computer that says like how clean your vehicle is running, right? Well, the company didn't fix their emissions. Their emissions were still dirty, but they programmed the computer to say that they were clean, to kind of cheat to get around it. Did anybody else hear about that or not? So in that instance, they weren't actually doing what the law required them to do, which was to make the cars run cleaner, but instead they were kind of designing something to cheat to make it look better. So like, let's say West Fargo High School reported our graduation rate as like 100%, right? So our organization does not exist to like break the law, but just to make ourselves look good, we reported it was 100%. That wouldn't be organized crime, that would be corporate crime, okay? Now, a white collar crime is where individuals working in the business, so it's a legitimate business, and the business itself is, or like a large number of people in the business aren't doing shady stuff. It's just one person in the business abusing their position to make money for themselves or appear better or whatever. So an example of that, there was a car dealership in Moorhead that the finance guy there embezzled money from them for like 6-7 years and then got caught. And so he would like filter funds from their business accounts towards his personal accounts, right? That's white collar crime, okay? And then also know the difference between some different theories of deviance. So differential association, strain theory, and labeling theory are some of the theories that were discussed in Chapter 7. Differential association, strain theory, and labeling theory. Labeling theory says that what matters for deviance is not so much what the act is itself, but the label that people attach to it or how people respond to it. So related to labeling theory, they talk about the terms primary deviance, secondary deviance, and stigma. So primary deviance is where people engage in deviant acts, but it's not really that big of a deal. Whereas secondary deviance is where people start to make a deal out of it. And then a stigma is where people attach a powerfully negative label to something that's deviant. So I think probably the best example that our society has for that today would be how if you commit a crime and you like molest a child, you have to register as a sex offender, right? So that's a very stigmatic label, right? So again, labeling theory says what matters is not so much what the act is, but how people respond to it. Now, differential association theory says that deviance is affiliated in large part with the groups that you determine to hang out with. So the different groups you associate with, right? Differential association. So you're more likely to become deviant over time or to be labeled deviant if you hang out with people that are labeled deviant or engage in deviant activities. So you might like hang out with, let's say, the druggies, right? But even if you yourself don't do drugs at that time, other people might identify you as that. And then over time, there'll be pressure on you to eventually do drugs. And then strain theory. Merton's strain theory. Grace, can I borrow that book? There's a graphic in Chapter 7 that addresses it. That's the one where it's what are the goals and what are the means in society? So do you accept the goals and do you accept the means to achieve those goals? That's the question that Merton's strain theory asks. So remember we had that box that identified which category you were in. Where did it go? I should have you look for it while I'm... 160? Thank you. Okay, so this box, for those of you watching, page 160, right? So you have to ask yourself, according to strain theory, does society have, are there opportunities within society for people to achieve the goals that society has in socially acceptable ways? So if, let's say Tate I use the goal often to make more money. So he's deciding to go to school. Jamestown is your plan, correct? For nursing. So part of that's because you want to have a job and make money, right? Okay, so he is pursuing a goal that other people have that's commonly accepted. So he accepts the goal and he accepts the means. He's conforming. And then be able to identify the other patterns too. So if you accept the goal but reject the means, you're innovating. So, and it's all explained again on page 160. So there's a few application questions related to that. The other concept that's discussed a little bit is criminal recidivism. Criminal recidivism. So recidivism is the act of re-offending or committing a crime again after you get out of prison. What are those rates like, do you think? Are they high or low or average or... They're pretty high, yeah. So people that get out of jail have a pretty high recidivism rate, okay? And that again varies on their age and the crime they commit and stuff like that, but it is pretty high. So what are some things that jails try to do to limit that? Yeah, so a lot of colleges work with jails to offer programs for people so that they can improve their learning and maybe set up for a career after they get out. Yep. We also talked about the justifications for punishment. Justifications for punishment, that was when Officer Balvick came in. So you've got retribution, rehabilitation, societal protection, and deterrence. What are the things that matter for whether or not deterrence works? I talked about that. There's 3 things that matter. Like, so I say, I'm the principal, I say, don't wear your hats in the hall, right? And then the logic of deterrence is we're going to punish Grace for wearing her hat in the hall so that other people will see it, and then they'll get like afraid that they'll get punished too, right? So what matters? What determines if that works or not? Okay, severity of the punishment, yep. Now, there are things that matter more than severity though. What else? How closely correlated in time you offending, you committing the crime, and you getting punished occurs. So the further that is apart, the less effective it is as a deterrent, right? But the most effective deterrent of the 3 is the consistency or the likelihood in which offenders are punished. So I'll use speeding in Minnesota as an example. If you've driven through Minnesota, do people drive the speed limit? Do they drive close to the speed limit? It depends on where at, but not really, no. If you're on 494 or 694 and it's labeled 55, there's a lot of people doing 75, 80 pretty consistently, right? But how many people get pulled over? Not that many, right? So maybe like 1 out of, 40 speeders, what do you say? Right? So the people that are speeding are gambling, sort of, like thinking, I'm not going to get pulled over. They perceive the likelihood of them getting in trouble as being low. So the thing that matters the most for deterrence working or not is the likelihood of getting caught, not the severity of the punishment, not the closeness, the likelihood of getting caught. Okay, so that's chapter 7 in a nutshell. Let's talk about chapter 8 on stratification. What's the difference between income and wealth? Yeah, so income is what you make between job earnings and earnings and investments. And then wealth is the net value of your assets. So some people can have a pretty high income. Let's say this guy I knew in college, my wife, I'll probably switch to him actually because our dental plans changed, but this guy I knew in college started a dental practice in Horace called Maple Family Dental. So I don't know this for sure, okay, so, but if he's the typical like dental med school graduate, his income probably is pretty high right now, but he probably has a lot of debt from going to med school, right? So he might have, like, right now, his income is substantially higher than, let's say, Randy Holscam, right? Mr. Holscam. But I bet, again, I don't know this for sure, but I could see a scenario in which Holscam's wealth is greater than that guy's, right? Because I don't think Mr. Holscam has a lot of debt, right? Okay, so do you see the difference between the two? Okay, so we talked about that in stratification. We also talked about what Max Weber called socioeconomic status. So Weber's concept of socioeconomic status was a way in which he tried to explain stratification using more than just money. So what are the 3 variables that Weber looked at? And remember, Weber is spelled with a W because he's a German guy, okay? W-E-B-E-R. So what are the 3 variables that Weber looked at? Power is one, yeah. Money is another, so he still did look at money. And then what's the last one? Prestige or like social status, yep. So what is it called if you have somebody that has like a lot of prestige in their job but doesn't make a lot of money? That variable is called status consistency, right? So what would they have if they have a lot of prestige but not a lot of money? Or a lot of money and not a lot of prestige? Low status consistency, yep. So if you have somebody that let's say buses tables at Perkins, right? So buses tables at Perkins does janitorial work at Perkins, right? Lower income, low prestige, low power, right? They would have high status consistency because everything's the same, right? It's the same level, everything agrees. So then the head surgeon of the cancer department at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, high income, high prestige, a lot of power, a lot of education, that would be high status consistency also, okay? So let's say some random guy that isn't that well known but starts a business and makes a lot of money, but the business is doing stuff that's not like really that respected. So some guy starts like a porta potty business, right? Makes a bunch of money with that, like works with that all the time. That person would have low status consistency because they could make a lot of money, but not a lot of people would like respect that job, right? So be able to identify those terms. Also be able to explain the difference between some of the terms that Marx talked about, Karl Marx. So Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, which is the basis for which of the main perspectives in sociology? Conflict theory, yep. So to Marx, what mattered was who controlled the means of production. The people that controlled the means of production he called the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class. And then the workers that would experience what he called alienation were called the proletariat, or the proletarians. So why would the workers, or why would lower class people experience alienation according to Marx? Why would lower class people experience alienation according to Marx? No idea? What are they isolated from? No, not necessarily. They're alienated because they're isolated from the fruits of their labor. They don't experience the fruits of their labor. So in short, Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists, exploited the workers, and the workers feel this sense of alienation because they don't get to be justly rewarded or justly see the fruits of their labor. So what did Marx think would happen ultimately? Like, would people just deal with this forever, or what would happen? More than that. Yeah, there'd be a violent, bloody revolution that would create ultimately a classless society. That's the Marxist vision. Okay, we also talked about the difference between a caste system, a class system, and a meritocracy. Now, as defined, a caste system is a system where your position in the social hierarchy is based on ascription or based on birth, right? Whereas in a meritocracy, your position is based totally on merit. So do you have the skills and the qualities that people in society desire, right? So how about a class system? What's a class system like then? Yeah, it's a mixture of the two. Yep. So which societies tend to be more meritocratic? What are some examples of societies that are more meritocratic? Or even sub-parts in society. Like, what's an example of a institution, a business, an organization that's more meritocratic? I gave the best example of one, I would argue, in the United States would be, well, I would say professional sports, right? Because they want somebody to win, right? So they don't care if you're the NBA, right? If you're 6'10" and have a 35-inch vertical and you shoot 50% from the field at 3-point range, like, they don't care if you're Asian or Mexican or whatever, right? Like somebody will pay you to play basketball, right? So professional sports tend to be very meritocratic. Okay, what's it called when you can move up or down in the social system? Social mobility. Yep. So what is it if like John and Susie get married? So they're poor. They get married, they stay poor, they have a kid, they're still poor. Their kid starts a business and becomes very wealthy. Is that, for their kid, is that intergenerational social mobility or intra-generational? Intra, because it's within his life. Yep. If his parents, they start out poor, they start a business, they become wealthy, now they have a kid and the kid is wealthy, that's intergenerational. Intra means within, inter means between generations, right? Inter means between or across, like the interstate highway system. Intra means within. Okay? Okay, what's the difference between, let's shift to chapter 9 a little bit. So remember we talked about stratification in general. That's just the way in which people within a society are structured in a hierarchy based around a number of factors: power, prestige, wealth, obviously. So when we're talking about global stratification, we're comparing countries to countries, right? What's the main variable they use for countries? Like, how do we determine which country is higher than another for the most part? Mostly GDP, so that's wealth, right? But there are instances where wealth doesn't necessarily matter as much as other things. So depends in part on how GDP is calculated and all that stuff. But it'd be interesting to see, like, during World War II, what was the GDP of, let's say, Germany versus Russia versus the Soviet Union, I should say, versus the United States. So there is a correlation between military power and money, but it's not one-to-one. So somewhere we could find a country that's like really strong militarily that has lower GDP than like another country where their military is not as strong, but their GDP is pretty high. But again, in global strat, the thing that matters the most is money. What are the three categories of countries now? High, middle, and low income, and that's based totally on per capita GDP. So there are a few questions on this test similar to the last quiz where it's an ordering question. So it'll give you 4 countries and you have to put them in order based on GDP per capita. Now, it's going to be impossible for you to memorize like every single country, right? So it's not like I picked like 4 countries from Europe and put them in order, right? So there might be 2 countries from Europe, but there's clear distinctions. So the way that I would study for that part is there's a map in the book in chapter 9. I would look at the map and then I would think about the tendencies for locations for different countries. So where are most high income nations located? Northern Hemisphere. Northern Hemisphere and, well, more specific than the Northern Hemisphere. It's page 227 for those of you that are curious. So Europe, especially in general in Europe, okay, in general, the further north you get and the further west you get, the better. In general in Europe, the further east and the further south you get, the worst. So like Greece has had a lot of economic problems in the last 4 or 5 years. Like Bulgaria and Ukraine, those countries are worse off than like Britain and France, right? So I would try to think in generalities, right? So in generalities, if you see a country and you know it's in Europe and you're not sure, high income, right? North America, high income. South America is mostly what? Middle, okay. Africa, depends on the part of Africa, but yeah, low. Asia, there's a little bit of everything, right? So China and India are there, and those are pretty large countries. They are middle income nations. But in Southwest Asia or the Middle East, their income's pretty high because of oil, right? So if you see like Kuwait on there, you know, Kuwait is in the Middle East, right? That's pretty high per capita GDP. So there's a few questions like that where you have to put them in order. You also talk about some of the theories related to global stratification, like what caused it. So colonialism and neo-colonialism. Colonialism is the direct control of one country by another, whereas neo-colonialism, neo means new, right? So if you see like in philosophy or study of religions, there's like Neo-Confucianism, means new Confucianism, right? So neo-colonialism is where a very powerful country exerts control over, or a very powerful company, a multinational corporation exerts control over a country that doesn't have that much power. So you see this on a smaller scale, like in cities, where Amazon just took a lot of heat because they were creating like a second headquarters, and then they'd go to like different cities and say, you should build this here, and then the cities gave them like big tax breaks to try to recruit them. Did you hear about that at all? So they like go to the city and they say, you should give us these big tax breaks, and some people in the city think, well, that's not really fair, but if you want that company to stay there or come there, then you kind of have to give it to them. So think of that thing, but at a country level, that's neocolonialism. So from a theoretical perspective, the two theories that are used to explain global stratification are modernization theory and then dependency theory. So which one aligns more with functionalism? Modernization or dependency? Which one aligns more with functionalism? Modernization, yeah. So modernization theory says that the reason poor nations are poor is that they haven't modernized, right? Whether that's technology or whether that's cultural beliefs. Whereas dependency theory says that wealthy nations keep the poor nations poor so that they can exploit them. They don't like help them develop as much technology. They don't help them to change their laws, because if they did, then you wouldn't be able to keep getting like cheap goods from China or whatever. So like, let's say that today, this wouldn't happen, but let's just say today China implements a policy that they have like a nationwide minimum wage where they pay everybody the equivalent of the American middle wage right now, right? So which is $7.25 an hour, right? I don't know. What would happen to the price of goods coming out of China? Go way up. So dependency theory, which aligns more with conflict theory, says that the wealthier nations don't want that to happen. They don't want to like improve wages there, because if they do, it's going to lead to increased costs for their supplies. Also related to stratification, I forgot this from chapter 8, is something called the Davis-Moore thesis. The Davis-Moore thesis. The Davis-Moore thesis is a functionalist analysis of stratification that holds that the reason inequality exists is so that society can draw talented people into occupations that are deemed essential. So the Davis-Moore thesis believes that stratification is functional and it's fair because you're paying people more for positions that are needed for society to operate. So at the end of the day, I like to use the person bussing tables at Perkins, right? So I've done that kind of work before. I've worked food service before, so it's like I respect people that work in that, and you know, people often don't appreciate them and whatever. So I don't mean to demean somebody that's doing that, but the Davis-Moore thesis would argue it's okay to pay them less because that's not really absolutely essential for society to function. But we really want like brain surgeons, right? We want the most talented people to be able to do that. So let's pay them a lot of money to draw people into that. Okay. All right. So that's chapter 9 in a nutshell. Chapter 10 is on gender stratification. So I talked about the distinction between the terms patriarchy and matriarchy. Patriarchy is a system of rule in which there's males in charge. In a matriarchy, it's a system of rule where there's females in charge. What are most societies traditionally? Patriarchies, yeah. Now there are some distinctions. So you're going to want to check out in the text, it talks about the research of, and some of this was in the practice quiz too, but Carol Gilligan, who we've mentioned before, Margaret Mead, George Murdoch. So you're going to want to look at some of their research a little bit. So for example, for one of those, oh, and Janet Lever too, Lever. So the Gilligan example we've discussed before, that has to do with moral reasoning based on gender. So in short, you want me to repeat those names? Or? Okay. Murdoch, Murdock. Lever is Lever. Gilligan, Gilligan. And then, did I forget one? Oh, Margaret Mead, yep. So Margaret Mead was a feminist that researched a bunch of societies. And she found that while there were some patterns in gender roles, it wasn't universal. So she found some societies where like women tended to be more of the initiators or more of the decision makers. But in patriarchal societies, that's not always the way, right? So, and then back to the example with Gilligan. Gilligan talked about moral reasoning. So for males, it tends to be moral reasoning is based on clear rules, like did you violate this standard or not? Whereas for females, it had more to do with the feelings, the relational aspects. And then Lever and Murdoch were contemporaries, or they were researchers that followed up the research of previous researchers. So Lever, for example, talked about types of games that people preferred to play. So males tend to prefer games that have like rules, like do this, do that, do this, do that, and then there's a very clear winner. So competitive games with a very clear winner. In chapter 10, again, gender stratification, that's where I had talked about that term intersectionality again. So intersectionality is where multiple levels of minority status intersect to create like greater disadvantage than one of those would be by itself. So if you're, let's say, handicap minority woman, you would have a number of different difficulties compared to somebody that is just a minority woman, right? Because you've got that extra level. But it's not like, so let's say if somehow we've put a value on the difficulty you experience because of all of those statuses, and it's like -10 for each of them, if you had all three of those, it wouldn't be -30. It has kind of an escalating effect. That's a key thing around intersectionality. So if you've heard the expression, what is it? The sum is greater than its parts. So that's what intersectionality theory would believe. Okay, let me just scan through this and then I'll give you some time to ask some questions and we'll go from there. And as always, I leave some stuff in here that we don't talk about. Oh, types of slavery. That's something I should discuss. So write down types of slavery. So again, with the Davis-Moore thesis, there's a few questions on here that ask you, it'll give you a quote and you have to pick the statement that matches the Davis-Moore thesis. So there's 3 or 4 questions about that. So types of feminism and types of slavery are the 2 things that I missed that I want to talk about. And then that'll be it unless people have questions. Okay, so types of slavery would be chattel slavery. That's CHATTEL. And then debt bondage, human trafficking, servile marriage, and child slavery. And this is on page 232 and 233. 232 and 233 if you're curious. So the one that we've heard, so there's a couple of questions where it describes a situation, you have to identify which type it is, okay? So the one that we think of probably most in the West, when we think of slavery in the United States, we think, American Civil War and the South having slaves, right? Where you directly own one other person, which type of slavery is that, of those that I listed? So on the test, it'll give you a scenario and you have to identify. It doesn't ask you for the definition, it says. Here, that's chattel slavery, okay? Debt bondage is like, I owed somebody a bunch of money, I can't pay it back, so I have to be enslaved to them. Child slavery is like, you'll hear stories. I used to play a video about these kids that, because of the conditions in a country, they like have to quit school and go to work and they make very, very little money, right? So that's like child slavery. Human trafficking is kind of a hot button issue we talk about now. So that's the movement of people against their will from place to place, often for like sexual reasons, but sometimes for labor too. And then servile marriages would be like in some countries where they have arranged marriages and men are allowed to marry more than one woman. It's like your parents might like sell you to another person basically. So then you're like forced to get married to this person and have sex with them and stuff, but you don't have really a choice in that matter, right? So that's a form of slavery too. So be able to identify those situations.
There were 4.
There's 5.
5. What's the chattel, human trafficking, child slavery, debt bondage?
Servile marriage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then types of feminism, that's in chapter 10. So it's radical. Radical feminism, liberal feminism, and then socialist feminists. It's page 266. If you're curious, page 266. So liberal feminists basically say that society is fine the way it is, like in terms of the core structures of society. So we don't like totally have to change everything. We just need to do like catered laws to kind of improve the existing structure of society. So those are liberal feminists. They would say like, let's create more scholarships for women. Let's pass laws that ban discrimination or solidify those, right? Let's keep working within the existing system to try to fix what's wrong. Socialist feminists say that the problem is capitalism. So it's deeper than just like men that might be sexist or whatever. So the solution is to create a more socialistic society where wages are equal. Socialist feminists might point to like how women often have to raise children and men don't have to, so that creates some inherent inequality in the system that could be fixed if we didn't have capitalism. And then radical feminists would say that the distinctions between genders are the problem. So they argue in the more extreme sense and getting rid of all references to gender. That's the radical feminists. So you see, I say this quite a bit in class, but when you look at, if somebody says like, I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, I'm a feminist, or whatever, you need more information to figure out what they exactly believe. So that's an example. Okay. So same thing, you're going to see a couple scenarios on that. It'll say, Grace believes that capitalism is the root cause of inequality between men and women. Which type of feminism does she subscribe to? Socialist feminist. Yep. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions about anything at all? So if you have questions, like I know some people said they'd have to leave. So if you can leave now, and then you still get credit for coming. But if you want to stay and ask questions, you can. I'm free to stay. I'd say, what time is it now? Probably about 15 more minutes if anybody wants to. So go ahead.
What was the difference between primary and secondary deviance again?
Okay, so primary deviance is where you first engage in the act of deviance, whereas secondary deviance is when other people start responding to it. Yeah. So let's say like, I'll use the example of like drinking, right? North Dakota is a state that's known for having a high level of people that drink and like binge drink too, according to the definition. But so many people do it that it's like, whatever, you know? So that'd be primary deviance. But if you like start missing work or get a DUI or whatever, or your like spouse gets upset at you, you know, that's secondary deviance then, okay? Okay, go ahead. What, last name what? Frank? I don't remember that. So then, yeah, unless you're Miss, you said Frank? She took her book. I was gonna check in the index. Oh, can I borrow that? Oh, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it then. Yeah. So I just retyped all the tests into Schoology today, a lot of it, and I don't remember seeing that, so I would. Yeah, anybody else? Now that bothers me because I don't like not knowing stuff, so.
It wasn't in the index because I was trying to find it.
Go ahead, Emily. Okay, Robert Merton came up with strain theory. And strain theory basically asks the question, are there enough ways in society for individuals to achieve the goals that they have? So do they accept the goal, and do they accept the means of achieving that goal? If there's not enough ways for people to achieve the goals in society, that creates strain, and then that leads to changes within society. So yeah, so the box. So I'll use like dating or finding spouses as examples, right? Merton and other strain theorists would argue one of the reasons that dating apps emerged is because people had this goal of like meeting somebody and, you know, developing a long-term relationship with them, getting married, right? The acceptable way of doing that is like meet somebody, have coffee, go out to eat, get to know them, you know, but it was too hard for people to connect. That created a strain in society, which led to innovation, the new way, which would be dating apps, right? So, but then over time, another tenet of strain theory is that what was innovation for a while becomes like normal. So like business models, for example, like video game, you know, my wife and I like to play video games together. So it used to be like you buy the system and then you buy the video game and then you can just play it as much as you want, and that's kind of where you make your money. Now, a lot of the games that are making a ton of money actually are free, but then they sell like all these add-ins. So that's like Fortnite, right? Fortnite makes a ton of money. Candy Crush before that, if anybody got into Candy Crush or whatever, they'd let you download it for free, but then if you want extra lives, you have to pay like $1 or something. And they just make tons of money, like just perpetually like that. So that was innovation, but then it becomes conforming over time. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. That Frank is on page 238, by the way, if you're curious. Because there's a section in the index that it's just names, and you can look up stuff by names, but yeah, that's not on the test, so there you go. Anybody else? Anybody else? All right. See you later.